Hello, I'm Dr. Jeff Thompson from Yakima, Washington. Happy to be with you today. I'm going to be talking with you today about connections between St. Benedict's rule and spirituality and my line of work, which is psychotherapy. So I'm titling this series of lectures, A Handbook of Healing, the Therapeutic Value of Benedictine Spirituality. So let me introduce myself a little bit. I'm a psychotherapist in Yakima, Washington, and an oblate of Mount Angel Abbey. Just so you know a little bit more about me, I was converted to the Catholic Church on Holy Saturday, received on Holy Saturday of 2011. I'm also an Ignatian spiritual director, so in addition to psychotherapy, I really love the interplay between St. Ignatius and St. Benedict in their respective spiritualities. My dissertation research was looking at integrating another favorite saint of mine, my patron saint, St. John of the Cross, and an area of psychology called affective neuroscience, which I'll definitely tell you more about in a few minutes. My long-standing interest is in the intersection and overlap of spiritual theology, spiritual direction, and psychotherapy for the cure of souls, which is really the literal meaning, the literal translation of psychotherapy, the cure of souls or soul healing. I want to introduce you to somebody who's had a big impact on my development as an oblate, Esther DeWall. She's an English scholar on St. Benedict and especially on the rule. And I'm just going to give you a brief quote from one of her works called Living with Contradiction. Concern for healing and wholeness is a theme much written or spoken about. There are countless paperbacks with the word healing in the title. There are countless workshops which hold out the promise of healing. Faced with something which none of us can evade, even if we wanted to, I believe that we can turn to the rule of St. Benedict and find there a handbook of healing. So I want to take that phrase, that last phrase, a handbook of healing, and really work it through this series of talks in several parts. But first, what do I mean, and what does Esther mean by a handbook of healing? The very first words of the Rule of St. Benedict really start this whole understanding of spiritual and psychological healing. Listen carefully, my child, to your master's precepts, and incline the ear of your heart. Receive willingly and carry out effectively your loving Father's advice, that by the labor of obedience you may return to him from whom you had departed by the sloth of disobedience. So according to St. Benedict, the cure of souls involves a return to God through a labor of obedience, a path of inner and community healing, which his rule outlines. On the other hand, psychological science has advanced exponentially in the last century, far beyond what even a first-rate psychologist and theologian like St. Benedict could have known. So what I'm looking for in my research and in my practice is a way of connecting psychology, which is rooted in science, and theology, which is an entirely separate way of knowing. So to do that, bear with me as I get into the weeds a little bit here. I'll try not to do this very often. But how do we connect two things as different as psychological science and theology and spirituality, which often find themselves opposed to each other or seemingly opposed to each other? So I want to talk about this Chalcedonian model. This is from a scholar from Princeton Seminary, Deborah Van Dusen Hunzinger. She takes from the theologian Karl Barth this idea of pulling together theology and psychology in the same way that the Nicene theologians pulled together the full humanity and full divinity of Jesus. Looks like this. She says that in the same way that Jesus is fully God and fully human, 100% of humanity, 100% of divinity, They're distinct, but they're inseparable. And at the same time, the divinity obviously is of an infinitely broader scope than the humanity. So Dr. Hunzinger suggests that we can look at the connection between psychology and theology similarly. They're two distinct things, but they're inseparable, and theology has the much greater scope. Now, just to widen that a little bit more, I also used in my research a model proposed by Dr. Viktor Frankl, who's most famous for writing a book called A Man's Search for Meaning, about his survival in the Auschwitz death camps and how he developed a form of psychotherapy based on finding meaning in any circumstance we find ourselves in. But to do that, he proposes, again, a way of connecting science, he's a medically trained psychiatrist, and theology, and several things in between. Now here's where I want to get a little further into the weeds. We are biological creatures. We share that with plants and animals. We are psychological creatures. We have higher ways of thinking, rationality. We're able to problem solve. We're able to build huge cities, advance our technology, build cell phones, and make them more complicated all the time. We are also, now here's a funny word, noological creatures. Noology comes from a Greek word, nous, which sometimes gets translated as mind, but that makes it sound more intellectual than it is. Think of it more like intuition. If psychology is about our rational processes, noology is about our intuitive processes, our higher ways of knowing. Knowing without necessarily knowing how we know. We just get it. It's something we get in our gut, for example, something we just catch, if you will. So far we're still on Earth, the biological connecting to the psychological, connecting to this noological, this intuitive. But that outer ring is the theological, the highest of all. This is knowledge of God. And human beings operate at all of these levels. We're the only creature in the universe, actually, that operates at all of these levels, which is what makes us so distinct in creation. So with this model, I want to move back and forth among those four rings that Dr. Frankl proposes. I'll be talking about some biological facts about our brain, some psychological facts about how we think, some noological facts about how we feel and interpret and relate to each other, and ultimately about where all of that fits and how we rise through Benedictine spirituality in this case to deeper and deeper knowledge of God, which is the literal meaning of theology. So let's start with the theology. What am I drawing from? Traditional Catholic understandings of theology. There's two parts to this deposit of faith that the apostles handed down to us. Infallible scripture and infallible tradition, both operating together, both interpreting each other. So if you want to think of this in terms of what the Catechism of the Catholic Church has spelled out, what the teachings of the Fathers, the teachings of the various ecumenical councils have handed down to us, all of it breaks down to essentially tradition and scripture within the Catholic Church. Now for psychology, which is a gigantic field unto itself, I'm going to draw from one part of it. It's called affective neuroscience. Affect is our emotions. Neuroscience is about what's going on in our brain and nervous systems. There's just been a huge growth in the last 30 years or so, starting in the 1990s. When I was going to grad school, one of my professors introduced us to this new concept called the decade of the brain. This was in the early 1990s. And he showed us an issue of Scientific American that talked about the coming decade of the brain. We were just really being able to look at the brain's functioning in real time with various kinds of scans, technologies that were only coming into use at that time. So that's the neuroscience. A part of neuroscience is what's going on in my brain, in my nervous system, when I'm experiencing joy, when I'm experiencing sadness, when I'm experiencing loneliness. So this field or subfield of affective neuroscience, looking at how we feel and how we relate to each other, how those things develop over time through our lifespan, affective neuroscience. One of the main researchers I've drawn upon is a psychoanalyst and neuroscientist. This is Dr. Alan Shore from the University of California, Los Angeles. And he wrote a series of books, a trilogy of books, that were the mainstay of my research, all centered on affect regulation or affect dysregulation. Affect regulation is how do we modulate our feelings? How do we bring our feelings up and down? Or affect dysregulation, when we lose control of our feelings. So this trilogy of books starts with the origin of the self, where he talks about brain, nervous system, attachment, mother-infant connection, how relationships form us. How do we gain a sense of self through interactions, the interactions of our genetics, with our mothers, and then fathers, grandparents, aunts, uncles, siblings, the wider neighborhood, the school, and so on through our lifespan. How do we develop a sense of self from all of that? He moved then into affect dysregulation and disorders of the self. Obviously, life is not a smooth ride for any of us. And so oftentimes we have struggles with our sense of self. We get into, we're born into a home where there are a lot of things going wrong, a lot of stress. We marry somebody who is really not compatible for us. We have a child who has a very difficult personality, a very difficult temperament that really taxes our patience. All of us have situations where we are at risk for affect dysregulation, and that disrupts a sense of self. We say, I'm sorry I got so angry, I flipped my lid. We say, I can't take this. We say all kinds of things to try to express what it is when we are not ourselves. It's even embedded in our language, even before neuroscience came along. I'm sorry I got so angry yesterday, but I wasn't myself. We talk like this, and there's a lot of neuroscience piling up now that shows what's going on and why. And then thirdly, Dr. Shore wrote about affect regulation. You might almost say re-regulation, but that would have probably been a tongue twister of a title. And the repair of the self. How do we pull it back together? If we go through a childhood that's full of terrible difficulties and we don't learn how to manage our emotions, let alone our thoughts, how can we, through things like psychotherapy, medication, healthy relationships, changes in our environment, how can we essentially pull it back together? Again, that's been in our language for a long time. How do I pull myself together? Which is really a repair of the self. Makes me move a little closer to the best version of myself, affect regulation. So that's the psychology I'm going to be drawing from in these talks. Our journey in these talks is just going to follow the flow of Alan Shore's trilogy, but with heavy doses of St. Benedict. So for the rest of this session, I'm going to talk about how did we get here, the origin of the self. Next session, I will talk about, well, where are we now? How does the self get disordered? What makes us so messy? What makes relationships so difficult? And then in the third session, just so I'm not leaving you in the lurch, how do we get where we're going? How do we repair the self? Not just psychologically. Psychology, and I want to emphasize this as a psychotherapist, psychology has very clear limits. There is no kind of psychotherapy that's going to completely repair what's wrong at the core of us human beings. Only theology can do that. Only spiritual growth towards divinization, union with God, to use the traditional language of spiritual theology, can really help us. Only salvation in Jesus Christ, through the repair of the self over the course of our lifetime as we work our way towards heaven. Obviously, the theological side of this vastly transcends the psychological side of this. But we have to understand what's happening psychologically, know what to repair, see how far we can get through psychology. But then that's where St. Benedict comes in, I believe, along with other of our great theologians in the church, to show us the true way to repair of the self. So, spend the rest of this session talking about the origin of the self. How did we get here? Starting with the theology. We have to begin with a fundamental fact. Human beings are created in the image and likeness of God. Psalm 8 says that we are a little less than a God. And that's really true. Think back to that model of Viktor Frankl I showed you a few minutes ago. We are biological, psychological, noological, and theological creatures all at once. We're the only thing in the universe, the only aspect of creation that can operate at the spiritual level down to the biological molecular DNA level. Angels can't do that. Animals can't do that. Only we can do that. And that's right there, a huge aspect of what it means to be created in the image and likeness of God. We are destined for great things. We are created to be a little less than a God. Now we'll talk about why we fall so far short of that in the next talk. But for now, I just really want to emphasize what we are, what I am, what each of you are, essentially, no matter what's happened to you in your life, no matter what direction your life has taken. You are a God-created soul in a God-created body, a unity that altogether reflect the image and likeness of God. And that's a beautiful thing. Everything we consider when we talk about healing and therapy and spiritual growth has to really circle back to this foundational thing. God loved us, God created us, God made us for himself, to quote St. Augustine. Now, the psychological side of it, we move back towards the biological. The old question of, okay, what's more important in our development? Nature or nurture? Genes or environment? And the answer, of course, is yes. It's a combination, an interaction, a very dynamic interaction of nature and nurture. We can get some sense of percentages. Some parts of our personalities are more genetic. Some parts of our personalities are more environmental. But overall, it's one influenced by and influencing the other. So nature is about our genes, our DNA, what we've inherited. Nurture is the environment we're born into, the relationships we're born into, the home we're born into, the schools in the neighborhood we're born into, and so forth. So our psychology starts with this interaction between nature and nurture. Just to narrow that down a bit more, starting with nature, we're talking about temperament. And psychological science has identified 5 basic building blocks or super traits that make up who we are. Each of us is more or less sensation-seeking. Each of us is more or less intuitive versus sensing, in the language of the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which is a personality test some of you may have taken at one point. All of us differ in the way we process emotions. Some people tend to lean more rational. Some people tend to lean more emotional. All of us interact with our environment differently. Some of us like to structure it. Some of us like to just let things happen. And then, most fun of all, we all differ in terms of emotional stability, or in the old language, neuroticism. And that's basically how prone we are, each one of us is, to anxiety, anger, sadness, some of the more difficult emotions. These 5 building blocks, if you will, really trace heavily back to our genes. We're born with a temperament. Each of you who has more than one child knows that each of your children is very different from the others, and very different from you and the other parent. Sometimes it's baffling. Sometimes we wonder, did I get adopted into this family? We are so different from each other. That's temperament, and that's genetics. Now, nurture is heavily rooted in attachment. It's actually a lot of things that go into the environment that we're born into, but I just want to spend a few minutes on attachment for now. Because our first relationships, interacting with our inborn temperament, shape heavily who we become, for better or for worse. So I'm going to show you a picture from a program in Spokane, Washington, where I've taken a lot of training over the years. It's called the Circle of Security program. It's a therapeutic approach to at-risk mother-baby pairs. Mothers who are struggling with poverty, mothers who are struggling with severe stress in their lives, in their homes, trying to build the best secure attachment that they can so that the babies have the best opportunity to grow and develop. And this idea of a circle of security, all of us have seen it. If we've ever gone to a park with a playground, mother's sitting on a bench, the toddler, the preschooler is moving away from mom because of all the exciting things on the playground, but looks back at mom to check in every once in a while. Am I okay? Am I climbing too high? Is it okay to get on this swing? And if something happens that the child gets frightened or alarmed, runs back to mother. Now, mother, therefore, has 2 jobs. And at the left side of this picture, you see 2 hands. Those are the mother's hands. She's got 2 jobs. She wears 2 hats. One is to be a secure base for her child. And that means a launching pad. She is to launch that child into exploring that playground, for example, because the child needs to move, the child needs to climb, the child needs to see and hear and touch and taste, maneuver, manipulate, do all the things that a child's little body can do. Develops muscle control, develops the nervous system, develops all the sensory apparatus, develops the brain. The child needs to do that. And so as it moves away from mother to explore, her job is to be the child's secure base, to explore that child's exploration, to watch over, kind of protect from a distance, show with her face, with her words, what's okay, what's not okay, guiding the child into the best kind of experience that it can have. So the child is climbing, swinging, spinning, doing everything. There's a park near my house in Yakima where I used to take my kids when they were little. I miss those days. They're both grown and gone now. But I used to take them to feed geese and ducks at this little pond. And so my kids, I would watch, and they would move out from me to feed the ducks, swing on the swing, chase each other, and so forth. And occasionally look back to make sure I'm still watching over them, which I was. So when I talk about the mother's 2 jobs, mothers are our first relationships, but very quickly fathers become part of this circle as well, and they perform the same tasks. Now, let's say the child's out on the playground and they're playing near a bush or a shrub, and a bird suddenly flies out, frightens the child, and it becomes alarmed, looks back at mom, looks back at dad, runs back. Mom's job shifts from secure base to safe haven. Oh, come here, let me help you, let me take care of you, let me help you calm down. When the child is calm again, moves off to play. Mother's job shifts again, back to secure base. Now, when a mother and child can do this reasonably well, do this circle of security reasonably well, the child develops security. The child develops self-confidence. The child develops a sense of control and mastery. I've got this. Problems develop, though, when either the secure base or the safe haven job become a problem for the parent. Sometimes the parent is not secure herself being a safe haven. Very comfortable with having the child move away and explore. That's fine. Go and do what you need to do. I'll be here if you need me. But if the child does need the parent, the child gets a signal that doesn't feel right. The mother looks alarmed. The father looks tense. Something is wrong that tells the child, oh, I should keep my distance. So secure base develops just fine, and the child learns that it can't move closer or it'll cause trouble of one kind or another. Now this causes the child to assume, I'm on my own. I've got to solve my own problems. I've got to figure things out myself. So that's an insecure, avoidant attachment pattern, to use the clinical language. Other times, though, the parent has a problem being a secure base. The parent feels frightened herself when the child starts distancing himself from her, becomes frightened, becomes angry, feels rejected, signals the child, don't go away, stay close to me. That develops a different kind of insecurity in a child, an ambivalent, anxious kind of attachment pattern, again in the clinical language. And so the mother and the child keep close to each other, and when the child's upset, they stay upset. And almost like the child needs to be upset to give the mother a sense of purpose, a sense that she's a good enough mom. So a role reversal takes place. Actually, a role reversal takes place in both of these patterns. The child ends up taking care of the parent, either by keeping distant or by not having any distance. And that role reversal can develop tremendous insecurity in a child who is very small and very vulnerable. Now, in terrible situations of abuse and neglect, the whole circle breaks down. I won't go into too much detail about this right now, but in essence, a child sees the parent in situations of abuse and neglect as a predator, something to be frightened of and get away from. And so, child is frightened. The attachment system says, when you're frightened, go to mom. But mom is what you're frightened of. So your fight and flight systems say, get away from that predator. So move towards her and get away from her simultaneously. And it really just breaks apart the child's entire ability to relate to almost anybody, actually. Down at the roots of many psychopathologies is this kind of just broken attachment, broken circle. Now the result of this, I'm going to go more into some of the kinds of damage that can come from broken relationships, but doubling back for just a second to this idea of nature plus nurture, and back even further to this idea that we are born in the image and likeness of God with a God-created soul, embedded in a body, inseparable from it. This is how we become what we are. This is the origin of the self, far beyond psychology, but definitely including psychology. What we're going to move towards is what can go wrong. St. Benedict comes into play here. Back to this initial sentence from his rule. Usually we hear from psychology that, well, we're only human, we're not perfect, and we just need to live with that fact. And it's true. Psychology, though, also promises ways of becoming better human beings, and there are real limits, as I mentioned earlier. St. Benedict takes us further afield into the true reality of what's wrong with us. We need to return to God, he says. Well, why do we need to return? Where are we? Well, we've departed from God by the sloth of disobedience. Something has been broken in that relationship with God. The ultimate circle of security is the circle of the relationship between myself and my Creator. And if I'm spending my life running away from that Creator, disobeying that Creator, rebelling against that Creator, that ruins my life. That ruins my life at every level. St. Benedict is wise enough to know that we need a process. We need to engage in a radical change of life in order to return to God from whom we had departed, from whom we had run away. So psychologically, St. Benedict gives us a good sense, drawing from the Catholic tradition, of what's wrong with us. And this is what we'll cover in the next session. Thank you very much.